43 countries have now been named as targets in a single coordinated advisory. Not 43 companies. 43 countries. That's the scale of what 10 governments just put their names to in a joint warning about China-linked threat actors using compromised routers and EOT devices as proxy infrastructure for espionage, disruption, and prepositioning inside critical networks. Let's be precise about what this advisory actually says, because the tech press coverage has largely treated it as another China hacking story and moved on. It isn't. The operational detail in this document is unusually specific, and the threat model it describes has direct implications for how you think about your perimeter, your supply chain, and your incident response assumptions. The advisory covers what Western intelligence agencies have grouped under the Typhoon Naming Convention: Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and related clusters. These are distinct operational groups, but they share a common technique. They don't build their own attack infrastructure from scratch. They borrow yours. Specifically, they compromise end-of-life routers, SOHO networking gear, and EOT devices, cameras, NAS boxes, DVR, anything with an IP address and firmware that stopped getting patches 2 years ago, and they weave these devices into relay networks. Traffic flows through your neighbor's Netgear router before it hits your VPN concentrator. The source IP looks like it's coming from a small business in Ohio. It isn't. This is not a new technique. What's new is the scale, the coordination, and the explicit acknowledgement from 10 governments simultaneously that this is now standard operating procedure for these actors, not an edge case. The UK's NCSC, CISA, NSA, and their counterparts in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Germany, France, South Korea, Japan, and the Netherlands all signed this. That level of diplomatic coordination means they've been sitting on corroborating intelligence long enough to reach consensus. This isn't a press release. This is a coordinated disclosure with operational intent. So what's the actual threat model? Here's where it gets operationally relevant for engineers and SREs. The proxy network serves two purposes. First, it's evasion. If your SIEM is alerting on traffic from known Tor exit nodes or commercial VPN ranges, traffic relayed through a compromised residential router in Germany doesn't trigger those rules. The source reputation is clean. The IP has no threat intel history. Your geo-blocking rules don't fire. This is specifically why these actors invest in maintaining the proxy layer. It degrades your detection fidelity at the ingress point before any payload has been delivered. Second, and this is the part that should make infrastructure teams uncomfortable, the compromised devices aren't just relay nodes. They're staging points. Volt Typhoon in particular has been documented living inside network infrastructure for months, sometimes years, before taking any action that looks like an attack. They're doing reconnaissance, mapping internal network topology, identifying backup systems, understanding change management windows. The 2024 disclosures about Volt Typhoon prepositioning inside U.S. critical infrastructure, power grid adjacent networks, water systems, communications, described intrusions that had been running silently for between 1 and 5 years before detection. That's not data theft. That's preparation for a different kind of operation. The advisory specifically calls out several device categories. Small office and home office routers are the primary vector: Cisco RV Series, Netgear ProSafe, ASUS routers, TP-Link devices, Dre Tech Vigor. These are not obscure pieces of kit. They're in every small business, every branch office, every home lab. The firmware vulnerabilities being exploited are a mix of known CVEs with available patches that haven't been applied, and in some cases, 0 days that were unknown at the time of exploitation. The advisory doesn't enumerate specific CVE ID for the 0 days, which is frustrating but understandable. Disclosure timing on those is still being coordinated with vendors. For EOT devices, IP cameras and DVR systems running outdated firmware are heavily represented. Hikvision and Dahua equipment shows up repeatedly in the threat intelligence, not because they're uniquely vulnerable compared to every other camera manufacturer, but because they're deployed at enormous scale, and their patch adoption rates are effectively zero in most environments. If you have a camera system that your facilities team manages and your security team has never audited, that's worth a conversation this week. The NAS device category is also significant. QNAP and Synology devices running outdated firmware have been compromised and used as longer-term staging infrastructure because they have more storage and compute than a router. They are always on, and they are rarely monitored. A compromised NAS can exfiltrate data slowly over weeks without generating the kind of volume spikes that trigger alerts. Now, what does this mean operationally for different roles? If you're an SRE or network engineer, your firewall egress rules matter as much as ingress. These actors move laterally and then exfiltrate through compromised internal devices that have legitimate outbound access. If your internal NAS or camera system can reach arbitrary internet destinations on port 443, that's a gap. Egress filtering is tedious, and it breaks things and nobody wants to do it. Do it anyway. Start with your OT adjacent and EOT segments if you have them. The advisory also specifically recommends network segmentation for EOT and operational technology devices, putting them on VLAN with no lateral access to your primary corporate network. This is basic hygiene that most organizations haven't actually implemented because it requires coordination between IT and facilities and whoever manages the physical security systems, and that coordination is annoying. The advisory is essentially telling you that the annoyance of that project is now lower than the risk of not doing it. For security teams doing threat hunting, the indicators of compromise shared in the advisory are worth pulling into your detection stack, but be realistic about their shelf life. These actors rotate infrastructure regularly. The IP lists will be stale within weeks. What's more durable is behavioral detection. Look for unusual authentication patterns on network devices, unexpected firmware version changes, management plane access from internal hosts that shouldn't be touching your routers, and long-duration, low-volume outbound connections from devices that normally don't initiate external traffic. If you're a CTO or engineering leader thinking about budget, this advisory is going to be used by security vendors to sell you things. Some of those things will be useful. A lot of them will be NDR platforms that cost $250,000 a year and detect the same things your existing SIEM would detect if someone tuned it properly. The actual high-return investments here are patch management for network devices, which most organizations treat as optional, network segmentation for EOT, and logging on your management plane. None of those require a new vendor. One thing that's unclear from the reporting: the advisory references specific targeting of telecommunications providers and managed service providers as priority targets, because compromising an MSP gives you access to that MSP's entire customer base. The advisory doesn't quantify how many MSPs have been confirmed compromised, and the sourcing on that claim is vague. If you're an MSP or you use one for network management, that's worth asking your provider about directly, specifically what their network device patch cadence is and whether they have anomaly detection on their management infrastructure. The broader point here, and the one that doesn't get enough attention in the coverage, is that this is infrastructure-level pre-positioning, not opportunistic data theft. Opportunistic attackers take what they can get and leave. What the advisory describes is patient, methodical preparation, mapping networks, understanding dependencies, identifying choke points, in a way that only makes sense if the goal is future disruption capability, not just information collection. That's a different threat model than most enterprise security programs are designed to address. The concrete thing you can do today: pull a list of every network device in your environment, routers, switches, cameras, NAS, anything with an IP, and check when each one last received a firmware update. If you don't have that list, that's the first problem. If the list exists and shows devices that haven't been updated in over a year, prioritize the ones with management interfaces exposed to any network segment you care about. Cross-reference against the CISA Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, which is free and updated regularly. If a device is end-of-life and no longer receiving patches, it needs to be either replaced or isolated with no outbound internet access. That's not a complete solution to what this advisory describes, but it removes the easiest entry points and forces attackers to work harder for their proxy nodes, and they will find softer targets instead.